Hi guys, welcome to the channel. We just had round 2 of the 2023 Formula 1 season and it was in Jeddah. Now this is just my post-race chat, thoughts on the race and my feelings on how it went. Now if we get into quickly my race rating, I'd give this race personally a 3 out of 10. I thought it was an absolute stinker. It was pretty boring and I've got quite a few thoughts on the race and probably why it wasn't as good as it has been in recent years. Obviously we only had the one safety car, which arguably shouldn't have even been a safety car. Stroll parked his car in a safe place and they said it was something to do with the GPS was still on the track and that's why they brought the safety car out, but we could have easily had a VFC, if not just yellow flags. So yeah, that safety car spiced things up a little bit with some tyre strategies, but other than that it was pretty boring. Now, my main reason why I think this race sucked is just because of the main straight. Now, they've reduced the length of the DRS this season and they've moved the DRS detection zone, but it's still awful. It still makes sense to make that one overtake if you're going to make it down that main pit straight, and this just makes it boring racing. Everyone can make that move well before the braking zone and it just leads to really boring racing. There's no point making a move on another part of the track. The DRS zone that leads up to that final corner also lets you get extremely close to the car. I think that could be removed. And personally, I think this could be a track where DRS could be removed completely. Drivers try overtake down that main straight without the DRS, and I think that would make the racing a lot better around this track. Now, if I go into my winners of this weekend, I would say Red Bull leading their domination, a 1-2, which they haven't done in quite a long time actually, and yeah, Alpine had a strong weekend, both drivers finishing in the points, solid weekend from Alpine. Now my losers are McLaren. They sit bottom of the constructors on 0 points. Obviously there's another team on 0 points, but they've had the lowest finish. And Ferrari, they seem like the 4th quickest team, well off the pace, and yeah, pretty disappointing from Ferrari. So my moment of the race, now this was pretty hard to choose actually. Normally I struggle to pick one, but there wasn't really one favourite moment for me. I'd have to say potentially Alonso getting Perez into turn 1 was probably the best moment of this race, but even then Perez managed to get the pace back. As he had a much quicker car than Alonso today. So yeah, not great race for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but that was probably my moment of the race. I think it started quite interesting, and then as soon as you got into those pit stop strategies, you realised no one was really catching anyone else. It was quite interesting seeing Leclerc and Verstappen sort of coming through the field, but as I mentioned, those moves were just done down the back straight with DRS, easy pass, passed them well into the braking zone, and yeah, not very interesting overtakes. Compared to that overtake Alonso made on Hamilton 2 weeks ago in Bahrain, that was 10 times better than any overtake we saw today. So yeah, it's not about the amount of overtakes, it's just about the quality, and today I don't think they were very good. Now, going to my race ratings, so we'll start with Verstappen. Obviously qualified in P15 after having that issue in qualifying. Finished race in P2, couldn't really catch Perez. I don't know if he was sort of off the pace, but Perez was on one today. He was pretty rapid. But yeah, pretty solid drive from Verstappen. He seems pretty pissed off in his post-race interviews. He said he's not here to sort of fight through the field. He seems pretty annoyed, but obviously he hasn't won this race and a lot of people thought he was going to win every race this season, so there are issues with that Red Bull, and the issues do seem to be with reliability and teammate conflict. Now I don't think Perez is going to push Verstappen to the championship, but you know what happened in Brazil last year, there's clearly some tension between the two drivers, and yeah, I think Verstappen had a really good drive today, but that's probably their one weakness, but that weakness is very insignificant to how quick that car is. Now, they had a rapid car, and I'll get that into that in Perez's. Qualified P1, finished the race in P1. At the end of that stint, he was gaining on Verstappen, so it shows he did have great pace. Now he's insanely good at street circuits, is Perez. And another thing that the Red Bull is insanely good at, which obviously Perez didn't experience too much lead in the whole race, was the DRS. Somehow that DRS seemed to give them so much more an advantage than any other team. The car was quick enough in a straight line, but they seemed to have absolutely nailed the DRS and the aero package over that car. And that was their low downforce setup. They said in the sort of post-race press conference, that is their low downforce setup. So it would be interesting to see that around the likes of Monza and other low downforce circuits. Next on the list is Charles Leclerc. Now qualified in P2, really solid qualifying from Charles, but finished P7 after taking that penalty. Now he lost a position to Hamilton under the safety car. If you watch the clip back, it's extremely frustrating. He wasn't really pushing under the safety car when he's catching the pack. Hamilton pitted under the safety car and he lost the position, and that is why he was getting annoyed over team radio. Not really Leclerc's fault. He was probably trying to just manage his tyres, keep them nice and cool. But yeah, pretty poor from Ferrari, not too surprising from their engineers and strategy. But with the penalty, pretty solid drive from Leclerc. Obviously didn't have the pace. The Ferrari was probably the 4th quickest car this weekend. So I'll give him an 8 out of 10. I think it's pretty solid. Carlos Sainz qualified P5, finished the race in P6. Yeah, I'll give him a 6 out of 10, slightly sort of above average, decent drive, but nothing crazy. He's clearly not as quick as Leclerc this season. I thought he'd make the step up like Perez seems to have done, but if anything, he seems to have dropped off slightly. Yeah, really not that impressed from Carlos this season. Obviously, it's a long season, we've got a long way to go, but yeah, I don't think he's going to even come close to points with Leclerc this season. So moving on swiftly, Lewis Hamilton qualified P8, quite a way off George Russell, but managed to finish in P5. Now, I'll give him a 7 out of 10 for this. He was losing pace with the Red Bull. He was behind the Red Bull and he had his DRS open, and he was losing pace down the main straight. Now, if that doesn't show how sort of slow that Mercedes is compared to a few years ago, where they were literally neck and neck for the whole race, then yeah, it just shows how frustrating it must be for Lewis Hamilton. But there's not much to sort of say this season. They're obviously going through a massive change. Toto Wolff said that they don't really care what happens to the car. There's no shame, even if they copy their car to exactly the same as the Red Bull. They don't really care anymore at this stage. They just want a competitive car. But solid weekend from Hamilton, sort of not many mistakes. I'd give him a 7 out of 10. Now, George Russell, another sort of underrated strong weekend. A lot of people may not be sort of that impressed, like he's just there sitting with Hamilton, but he's out-qualified Hamilton, he's outperformed Hamilton in the race and actually on the podium when Alonso got his penalty. Now, Alonso's just been given a penalty as I record this for the pit stop, which I'll get into in a little bit. But yeah, he still managed to get a podium. I'd give him an 8 out of 10, really good drive from Russell, maybe even a 9 out of 10. And let's not forget, he's beating Lewis Hamilton in the same car. It's only his, second season at the team, beat Lewis Hamilton last season. And it's not surprising when he just goes out and beats Lewis Hamilton at a race like this. No one sort of gives him drive of the day or anything like that. Whereas I think, imagine if George Russell was beating Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, people would be sort of raving about it. But because it's come sort of common knowledge by now, I think he's just gone under the radar a bit, and I think he's probably one of the best drivers on the grid currently, George Russell, and he seems to connect with that car a little bit more than Hamilton is managing to at the moment. Next on the list is Fernando Alonso. Now, yeah, obviously he had that penalty, but he seems really happy. I think he's just happy to be in a quick car, second quickest car, and yeah, even after that penalty, he was sort of smiling and stuff like that. But he called out the FIA. Now, this is just classic FIA. They had 30 laps to give Fernando Alonso a penalty. They waited till the end of the race to give him a penalty. Now, why, I don't know. They couldn't give it to him during the race so he could try and make this up, put on a new set of tyres, try and make that gap. This is what we want to see in races. We want to see the penalty applied and the driver have to react and the team have to react to a pit stop, to something during the race. There's no point to sort of, oh, Alonso, you might be getting a 5-10 second penalty, maybe try push just on the safe side. It's not that interesting and it's not really fair on the driver. Now they had 30 laps to do this. They could have looked at the suspension data to see if the driver or the pitman lifted up the ends of the car. They could have done a lot of things. I'm sure they got cameras on the car to see if they touched. Now, if the person on the rear jack just rested the rear jack on the back of the car, I do understand why they gave this penalty, but I don't even know why the pit crew sort of risked this. I would even sort of say, right, the 1 second after the pit stop, after the penalty, just leave the car for a few more milliseconds and then we'll work on the car. That extra 0.5 of a second isn't worth risking when it comes to a 10-second penalty, and we know the FIA are extremely sort of happy to give out these penalties, as we saw in Ocon last season. But I think the FIA need to be more clear in, because Alonso called this out. He said, well, it just says you're, oh no, it wasn't Alonso, it was Mike Crack, the team principal. He called it out. He said it's quite ambiguous on what you can say, because it just says you may not work on the car. Now, does resting the rear jack on the back of the car mean you're working on the car? I would say it doesn't. But does it give you a slight advantage to, when the timer stops, just have to lift it up and not have to put the jack in place? Yes, it saves more time. So things like that, it's a bit difficult, it's a bit harsh, but I guess the rules are the rules. But I'd like to see all penalties in the future applied before the end of the race, unless it obviously is the last few laps or so. Now, moving on, Lance Stroll didn't have a great weekend. Qualified P6. Now he's not on the pace of Alonso, but he's still sort of up there. He's still doing pretty well. Obviously, he's still having issues with his wrist probably, and he had a mechanical issue which caused him to DNF. Now, before that DNF, he had a great overtake on Leclerc around the outside. I think turn 12, the long sort of hairpin halfway around the track. But it was sort of a decent weekend from Stroll. Nothing sort of crazy, but he's up there, and that's what I think Aston Martin need. They just need a driver. I think they want Alonso to sort of maximise it. Alonso probably isn't going to win the championship, so they just need two drivers up there, finishing third and fourth to get them that second in the championship, which I think would be an extremely, extremely impressive result for this season, coming from where they were last season. Next on the list is Esteban Ocon, and yeah, he had a much better weekend than he did in Bahrain last week. Qualified P7, finished the race 8th, and I'd give him an 8 out of 10. Extremely solid. Didn't really have any notes on Esteban Ocon. He was pretty solid, pretty quiet, sort of typical Alpine, sitting there 4th, 5th quickest car, ending in sort of the lower end of the points. And this is why I imagine they're going to sit for the majority of this season, if I'm honest. Same with Pierre Gasly. I'd give him a slightly lower rating. I'd give him a 7 out of 10, as he did qualify just behind Ocon and finished the race behind him. Where did he finish compared to Ocon? So he finished 1 place behind Ocon and qualified 3 places behind him. So yeah, he's still probably getting used to that car a little bit coming from AlphaTauri. But pretty decent drive, still in the points. I think if he can sort of keep up with Ocon this season, Alpine will be pretty happy, because I think Ocon was one of my most underrated drivers of the year last season. He did an extremely good job at that team. Next on the list is Lando Norris. Yeah, not a great weekend. 3 out of 10 I've given him. Now, this might seem a bit harsh, but I think a lot of these errors were quite self-inflicted. Now, I've written down that, is he having pressure from Piastri? He's had 2 years at McLaren with Daniel Ricciardo, who has been off the pace. Now, if you've got a driver you know's off the pace, you can drive a lot more comfortable in the car. If you've got a second driver, a rookie that's new to the team, and you've been doing all the sim work, you've been looking at his data, he's slightly quicker than you in the sim, you've done a few races at the track, and he's matching you on pace. Do you think Lando is slightly concerned and slightly worried that Piastri might, say, beat him on points or beat him on race position this season? And it's very rare that we see Lando make a mistake, and he obviously hit the wall into the final corner during quali. Now, this is an extremely rare sort of thing that Lando does. I think he didn't even make a single mistake last year. He had a few crashes that a lot of them weren't really his fault. Maybe the Leclerc one was his fault. But He's one of the most consistent drivers of the year, on the grid even last season and for the past few seasons even, and extremely consistent. And I'm thinking, is Oscar coming into the team having that competitive driver compared to Daniel sort of making him make these errors? You know what Leclerc happened when he was pushing with Verstappen last season, it forced him to make errors. Lewis Hamilton, when Russell came in, felt under pressure, made a few errors. Is this happening to Lando? Obviously it's just one mistake. He still had a pretty sort of consistent drive today, but it'll be interesting to see going forward. Obviously he took wing damage, and he actually said in the press conference after the race, his wing got damaged and had to pit to replace it because he ran over Oscar's wing after that broke. So it's kind of self-inflicted for the McLarens, but yeah, quite uncharacteristic from Lando to sort of have a really poor weekend like this with mistakes. So I'd have to give him a 3 out of 10. I'm a big fan of Lando. I think he is one of the top 3 drivers on the grid potentially, maybe top 5, but yeah, pretty poor from him this weekend. Now moving on to Lando's teammate Oscar Piastri. First full race in Formula 1, learned a lot, and yeah, I was really impressed. Obviously you can't sort of take this to sort of, there's not much context to this because that McLaren car is awful. It's so slow and they both had to pit to replace their front wings. So the strategy was out the window, but he replaced his front wing on lap 1 and did the whole rest of the race on one set of hard tyres. So extremely good management, and he was fighting for positions at the end. He did actually make an overtake, so we had some pace. Qualified P9, managed to get that McLaren into Q3. It would have been interesting to see how Lando could have got that car, because he's normally quite good at qualifying. He normally gets that McLaren. He over qualifies the McLaren and then drops back in the race. But yeah, qualified P9, finished the race 15th. But yeah, just took some damage and there wasn't too much he could do about that, to be honest. But I think if you're sort of Zach Brown, obviously you're going to be extremely annoyed that the car is awful, it's so slow, but you've got 2 drivers that are equally competitive, and the engineers on Piastri's side of the garage must be sort of quietly quite happy, knowing that their side of the garage, after sort of having Ricciardo there for 2 years, they've got someone who can push, and they know when the car is ready that that car can potentially beat the other side of the garage. That must be quite motivating. Valtteri Bottas next, and yeah, I didn't think this was a great weekend for Bottas. He got out qualified by Zhou, and Zhou beat him in the race. Now I'm not sure if Bottas took damage. I think I heard something that he took damage because he was at the back of the race all the whole race. He was at the back. He was the only driver that got lapped in the end. But yeah, just didn't have great pace. I'm not sure why. He did have a great weekend in Bahrain 2 weeks ago, but not on it today. 4 out of 10 for me for Bottas. Now Zhou, on the other hand, really solid, out-qualified Bottas, finished above him in the race. I'd give him a 7 out of 10 overall, and he made a great overtake during the race as well. Pretty impressed with Zhou, to be honest. He's definitely justified a place in Formula 1, that's for sure. I don't think he's going anywhere, and I think he's one of the most underrated midfield drivers currently. Obviously it's quite hard to tell where that Alfa Romeo sits in terms of order, but he's been pretty solid for me, no mistakes, and pretty good driving from Zhou this season. Alex Albon, he had that brake by wire issue, qualified P17 and DNF'd the race, so yeah, not a great weekend from Albon. The pace was there, kind of, I think. It was sort of, did seem like that Williams did have some pace this weekend. It was quick in a straight line. Lando was saying that the Williams was way quicker than their car. But yeah, not too much to judge with that mechanical during the race. I'd give him a 5 out of 10, just sort of an average performance, to be honest. Probably slightly under average in qualifying. But yeah, I think the Williams has made a step up this season, which is a positive for sure. Now Logan Sargent, on the other hand, kind of sort of mixed at Albon. Albon had a pretty poor quali, and I think the race was a little bit better, but Actually, I'd say it's probably the same actually. Logan Sargent, obviously he had that issue. He went over the white line on, it wasn't turn 27 like he said over the radio. So just after the pit exit, he went over, or the pit entry even, he went over the white line literally by like a few inches. And in Jeddah, it's different to other tracks. You don't have to keep one wheel in the circuit. It's if one wheel goes out of the circuit, that's track limits. And I just don't think Logan Sargent knew this, because I don't think it's the sort of thing that you would do to gain lap time. He probably would have gained a couple milliseconds by sort of keeping close to the wall. I've done a TikTok on it below if you want to actually see the clip. It's linked in the video description. But yeah, I don't think he knew that was a thing. So he'll learn that thing. He'll learn these things in Formula 1. But he had a pretty decent race, finished P16. And yeah, without that track limits in qualifying, he would have actually got into Q2. So he's shown some good pace in that Williams. And yeah, he surprised me a little bit. I thought Sargent might be sort of the Latifi 2.0 sitting at the back, not in terms of ability, but in just terms of position. If that Williams isn't competitive, it's easy for the second driver to sit at the back. But they've definitely made gains on that car this season. And yeah, James Vowles is James Vowles is doing wonders at that team. Nico Hulkenberg, quite strange from Nico. Same as last race, strong qualifying and then dropping back in the race. I'd give him an average about 5 out of 10. But is this what Haas wanted? They want a driver that goes pretty much unnoticed the whole race. I don't think he was shown on the F1 coverage once. Same as Bahrain, I actually didn't even notice him once. Across the whole 2 races I've watched so far, I haven't seen him in qualifying, I haven't seen him during the race, I haven't even seen him during a press conference. It just seems like he's sort of going under the radar, going missing a little bit. But I guess he's not damaging the car, he's not shunting it into walls. Is that what Haas want? He's kind of on the pace of Magnussen, and he seems to be quite a good qualifier. So they're obviously saving money from damage, but he's not gaining that many positions. And yeah, just doesn't seem to have that great pace in the Haas. Now comparing that to K-Mag, who's kind of the opposite. He doesn't have great quali pace at the moment, but if you look at his race position, he's finished in the points. And yeah, he did have a really good race. He made some really good overtakes, and yeah, obviously gained Haas a point, which is going to be extremely valuable this season. The midfield is super close. It's sort of all the way down after sort of Alpine. There's just anyone sort of could finish in that 10th spot. So I think it's going to be every point matters this season. And when they can get the points, that is going to be extremely helpful. Next, Yuki Tsunoda. Now, Yuki Tsunoda's, this might seem strange, but he's potentially my driver of the day between him and Perez. I think Perez obviously had the better race potentially, but he's got a much better car. I think the driver who outperformed their car the most is Yuki Tsunoda. Now, on my notes, I've got, so Tsunoda has, where is it? He's out-qualified and finished above Nick de Vries in the race twice now, in this race and last weekend. He's had no errors in either of the races, which seemed to be some of his issues last season. He was quite error-prone. Twice he's finished 11th, and he was running 10th until a few laps to go, when K-Mag caught him on the sort of, I think it was the second to last lap or something, which was extremely unlucky for Tsunoda. And K-Mag gave him quite a lot of high praise, saying his defending was brilliant, he knows where to put the car, he just seems to have gained the racing sort of racecraft ability. He had the raw pace, and now he seems to have the pace and racecraft. But yeah, just solid drive from Tsunoda. Obviously P11's not that flattering, but I think that car is probably the slowest on the grid at the moment, potentially between that and, what else could it be, to be honest? Maybe, I don't think the McLaren is slow. It's obviously that issue. Probably between them and the Williams this weekend, but last weekend they were a lot slower. So I think Tsunoda's doing a brilliant job at AlphaTauri. And gone quite unnoticed, to be honest. Nick De Vries, on the other hand, qualified P18, obviously behind Tsunoda again. P14 in the race. Finished P14. I'd give him a 5 out of 10. I thought De Vries would, not gonna lie, before the season started, I thought De Vries was gonna school Tsunoda. I thought he was going to come in and show Tsunoda wasn't good enough to be an F1, show his experience in the other racing series, and just sort of not embarrass Tsunoda, but just sort of show like, this is what you need, this is a talent you need to be an F1 driver. Now it's kind of been the opposite. Tsunoda's been like, right, I was with Gasly last season, but I'm showing now how good of an F1 driver I am, and I deserve to lead this team. And I think that Nick De Vries said that he wanted to lead the team, and at the current stage, Tsunoda is definitely the better driver of the two. Now obviously it's a long season, Nick hasn't got that F1 experience, he's been racing in other series, and Yuki's been out of the team for quite a few years now, so he might pick up a bit more experience throughout the season, but he hasn't impressed me as much as my expectations going into this season. Now if we look at the Drivers' Championship, Max Verstappen leads by just 1 point actually, and yeah, if Perez got the fastest lap, which he had before Verstappen took it at the end, he would be on 44 and Verstappen would be on 43, and Perez would be leading the championship. Now Alonso P3 with 27 points, Russell 21, then Sainz. See, this is what surprised me. I didn't realize the Ferraris were this low. Sainz on 20, Hamilton on the same, Stroll obviously down there with 1 DNF, Leclerc on 6 points, he had the DNF. Bottas is still in 9th place with that good result in Bahrain. Ocon and Gasly picking up some points, and then Magnussen also picking up an extra point. And then the last point scorer is Albon, and then the rest are on 0. Now look at McLaren down there, Piastri and Norris P19 and 20. Obviously it doesn't really mean much with the points, but that comes down to where you finished highest, like who has the higher finish, and they obviously don't have a higher finish than De Vries, Zhou, Sargent and Hulkenberg and Tsunoda. So yeah, McLaren fans are probably getting quite concerned at this stage. Now looking at the constructors, Red Bull are already running away with this. I'd probably bet a lot of money on Red Bull winning the championship. Mercedes doing what they do, seems like they don't have a very good car, but they are good at getting the points that they can. Well, you've got to give them credit for that. They're beating Aston Martin. Obviously a DNF from Stroll has to come into play for that, but when they don't develop a competitive car, like last season they didn't have a competitive car, but they were almost getting podiums every weekend. They are doing something right. Now Ferrari down in 4th, quite shocking for Ferrari. Alpine 5th, Alfa Romeo 6th. Now I think this is starting to sort of set the order of the teams and speed. If I had to put the order of where I think teams are going to finish, where I think the teams will be in the next 5 races, I think it'll be Red Bull, Aston Martin, I think it'll be Mercedes above Ferrari. So I'd go Mercedes and then Ferrari P4, I think Alpine will stay P5, Alfa Romeo P6, I think Haas will stay P7, actually no, I think Williams will be P7, Haas P8, McLaren P9 and AlphaTauri will be last. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few races. McLaren fans, they've got a big upgrade in Baku apparently, so keep your fingers crossed for that. Yeah, that's my race review and chat. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know if you think Alonso's penalty was harsh, what you'd give the race out of 10. As I mentioned, I'd give it a 3 out of 10. I thought it was an absolute stinker. Probably the worst race we've seen since Monza last year, when it finished under the safety car. Yeah, I was pretty bored during a lot of the race, to be honest, as Red Bull ran away with it once again. But yeah, leave your comments down below and thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.